Welcome to Fontribute, where we talk about fonts and their attributes. Fontribute. It's me, Thomas Jockin from TypeThursday again. So let's get into this week, what we're going to be covering. Took a second to load up. Sorry about that. So, Omnes is a rounded sans serif that recently had a narrow width edition made. Multiple different steps, basically narrow, semi-narrow, and regular width. And I chose this week to investigate what happens when you take a normal width typeface and you make a narrow component or font to go with the larger superfamily of Omnes. So this is the Omnes regular with its narrow counterparts. And let's move forward with the investigation. So, starting with the N, I think on the surface it would seem that this is very simple. Obviously, you can see some relationships between the narrow and the regular. The nature of the terminals have been maintained. It's kind of notice the roundness of these terminals, but not perfectly circular. They're not like a perfect circle right at the end. They're kind of more a rounded rectangle in relationship. The nature of the terminal on the top part of the stem is similar between both of them. In fact, it's a hard edge on the left side with a round part on the right side. Take note of that. And it appears in general the stem weight has been maintained consistent across the two steps. Now, the obvious point is the narrower is a smaller counter inside here versus here. The approach of the joint basically seems to try to marry or play along to what was occurring in the regular width as well. Was of interest, I was noticing this in the slide, it appears that if I take that measurement, I bring it over, whoops. Yeah, so we can see even though the inner counter has been dramatically reduced, the side bearings on the right, actually I should actually do a more fair comparison. Let's make sure they're equivalent on left and right. So I should probably put this on this side as a better demonstration. Yeah, so you can tell this overall, though, even though the inner counter has been reduced, the side bearings have been only very minimally reduced, very closely associated with each other. So I'm curious to see how this executes out across the design. Also noticing, even though I believe these stems, I need to check now. I'm going to check if this stem is the same weight. They are the same weight across both. So let's continue on our investigation. So this is the end so far. On to the O. I think the O is actually where we see a lot of variance between the Omnes and the regular and the Omnes Narrow. Sorry, I'm finding it cold right now. So obviously the width is the main note. If you notice, the Omnes one is wider than taller, right? The width of it seems more than the height. So it gives us kind of up long proportion, right, compared to the more narrow feeling, right, from the Omnes, which we expected, right, by making the counter smaller, that effect will occur. I think what stands out to me is a couple of notes. One is probably, I think, in response to the outer shape being drawn the way it was, the inner shape had to be compensated with it. I almost feel like there's actually an addition of contrast added in from the vertical to the horizontal weight that's not mimicked in the regular. So I'm curious how that will work when we see this in text settings. And yeah, in general, let's put it this way: it's almost like the curve radius of these, right, is much obviously tighter. It makes sense because it's a small amount of space, but let's see how this plays out in the usage. I also think it looks like the side bearings have been maintained compared from the regular to the narrow on the outside, while their inner counters have been dramatically reduced. I'm going in to check this out. Yeah, they appear roughly equivalent. Maybe it looks like there's maybe a slight reduction in the narrow, but can't verify visually yet. Onto the D. So again, the D, the main notes, again, you should be taking is that it appears, in some cases, actually, this one looks like, it does appear this is bigger, a bigger space than the regular. Whoa, nope. There you go. Let's check that out. Yeah, so actually there's an interesting case where the spacing has been, as a proportions has been adjusted as along the way. But beyond that, the general essential elements have been maintained. So notice the top terminal, right, how the bottom is handled, and even how the joint system is dealt with is different. Actually, you think it does appear that, as I'm looking more and more, it appears that this is basically the steps from here to where I just marked before. Seems more dramatic in movement than in the Omnes regular. I think this plus the spacing decisions might tip off where the intentions is for this narrow edition. But we'll see when we start seeing application. Onto the G. So again, the main anatomy parts have been maintained, right? So one standout part about Omnes has been this kind of wider loop section on the bottom, right, relative to the top bowl up here, and the position where the neck links up. It gives a very friendly feeling, a very almost humanist feeling to this G. This was attempted to be maintained, right? Notice the widerness of the bottom loop versus the top part of the bowl, and the position of the neck has been maintained roughly towards the middle, slightly to the left. Again, the nature of how the round was handled here and here was similar to the O. It's applied also in the Omnes G narrow. It does appear there's more tapering in general, right, as the neck connects to the bowl versus what's occurring in the regular. But and again, it does appear that the side bearings are equivalent or very, very close together. I think it's a little bit more has been added here versus negative side bearing on this side, and this one looks almost like at 0 over here versus looks like a negative side bearing over here. Onto the A. Again, the main theme is the counter has been reduced. It appears also that the crossbar segment of this bowl has been raised up compared to the regular. Excuse me. And again, it seems this means a slight increase of contrast in that joint area versus the Omnes approach. Looks like they try to maintain the proportion of where the terminal lines up next to the bowl, so that's been maintained even though the counter has been reduced. And it appears again that it's actually looser spacing compared to the Omnes approach, regular. The S, besides its width, right, narrowness versus the regular, I think actually that I don't know if you guys have been noticing, but it has been feeling like this whole S, these forms, the narrow ones, have been heavier than the regular. But however, if you just do clean measurements, they're equivalent to each other. So it appears that as the letters got narrower, the stem weights and all the other relationships were maintained the same. So far, that seems to be an observation I'm catching at the moment. Let's see how this pans out in text settings. But beyond that, it has all the essential elements of Omnes. So notice the roundness of the eternal versus the sharpness in the inside counter segment of the S, right, which was maintained from the original. Even it appears that even the slope of the spine has been maintained as much as possible between the two, so we can see that much from observation. All right, so from there, let's look at what's occurring when we set this in words. So the main note you should see in general is that the uppercase have been much more narrowed as well, right, as well as the lowercase. But what's interesting is I was noticing before is the spaces right here, right? I'll measure it now. If I check investigate that next to the regular, notice that it is looser than the regular Omnes spacing. So it seems that even though the counter spaces got decreased, the letter spacing, right, the spacing between the two letters, has been increased. Whoop, pardon me. Let's keep going. So notice the observation before on the individual slides, I was noticing some letters and some aspects were getting looser compared to their originals, and this verifies it so far. So pulling into the accent characters, we see that they've been maintained across from their source, with some narrowness occurring in tilde and circumflex between the two. Where appear, and then likewise these are narrower and look a little steeper in the acute and grave. Secondary punctuation like quotation marks and commas appear to be consistent. They have not been changed. The question mark has been narrowed compared to the regular, but the exclamation point has been maintained the same. Omnes does come in not only typical lining figures, right, which have been narrowed in this form. I think actually what's interesting is something like the 8. The 8 actually got dramatically narrower, right? It's actually looking at the regular, it feels like some of these numbers are actually like stretched out in the Omnes in the original versus the narrow edition. Some have not been modified that dramatically, like the 1, for example, has not been dramatically changed. It's narrower, but not by too much. And both have numerators and denominators in both the regular and in the narrow edition. Right, as you can tell, notice where this one ends and then where this one ends. But it appears they were conservative in their approach about that. They didn't want to make it as extreme of a jump at between the two 8s, for example, the lining figures versus here and here. So it looks like the degree of compression was varied based on the optical needs of the project. All right, so this leads to, when we set it in text to see what's going on, so this leads to a conundrum, is that while the basic structures are very simple, like they are parodied exactly 1-to-1 to the original, that's why it's considered an Omnes, part of the Omnes family, it appears a couple of notes. One, the decision to maintain the same weights in the stems and horizontals and whatnot, with the reduction of the white space in the counters, results in the narrow appearing heavier in typographic color compared to Omnes and regular. So I say this because I'm looking at the whole aggregate of the paragraph of Omnes, and what you should be noticing if you just kind of look back and kind of imagine it's like blocks of gray as opposed to individual lines of characters, that the Omnes Narrow looks heavier, even though we just noticed from observations that they are exactly the same stem weight. The variance is the amount of white space inside the counters that is changed, and I think that was causing this. Now, in consequence with it, if you notice, the spacing in Omnes regular is relatively tight, right? If I look at the two ends in Flynn, right, the relationship of that inner counter versus the space between the two ends, it's a pretty dramatic variance. And I think that's part of the charm of Omnes was from that spacing decision. It was kind of puffy and kind of cheeky in feeling. I think it's part of the reason why that has the feeling that it does. While it feels like the Omnes Narrow is almost like they designed it for text purposes. It's looser spaced, right? There's more actually consistency between the inner counter and the space between the two letters. Like in the Flint, for example. It's not that there is not a variance. There is clearly a difference between the inner counter and the space between two ends, but it's not as dramatic of a difference as in the Omnes regular. So it looks like in the translation into the narrow, some editorial design decisions were made to loosen the spacing, the general fit of the letters so far. I think that combined with the maintaining of the stem weight is causing a very different feeling overall between Omnes Narrow and Omnes Regular, just from the typographic color effects I'm seeing. Yeah. So, but and then scaling up to larger settings, it's actually an interesting moment where, for example, there's proportional things like the wideness of this E versus the narrowness of this R gives a certain character and feeling. Like, for example, the O as well. There's a certain relationship built up from those that by compressing them, which obviously makes sense, I'm not missing the point of this, but it does have consequences where it changes the flavor and the effect you're getting from the type. I think that much is very clear. And in some ways, actually, that effect, that spacing comes really apparent in the spacing decision difference really comes apparent in the larger settings like sunflower, like the SUN, sun, right? Notice the feeling of that versus the regular weight. And I think the maintaining of the same stroke weights, even though it's a narrower counter space, right? This compression of the counter spaces, it's almost resulting, again, even at this larger setting, like it looks optically heavier than its regular width counterpart. It's fascinating. Lastly, I was noticing, if you notice the nature of the contrast in the O, for example, right, how regular it is. There is a difference between the horizontal and vertical, but I guess because of how wide it is, it gave it enough time to transition very smoothly between the two that had to be sacrificed in the more narrow edition. So this leads to a more square profile overall, which seems very different than the feeling I would get from the regular width, excuse me. I say that because, for example, things like the P and the R, those bowls feel more appropriate. Those are kind of more squarish in nature compared to the O, and I think those actually hold up pretty well in this compressed, narrow format. So this point is more about the O in particular. Yes, so those covers most of my notes related to, what's the big takeaway you should take from this? Well, the idea is that, there are design decisions made when superfamilies are expanded like this, like for example into different widths, right? That it appears to be you should do your due diligence to investigate it, to make sure it's getting the same effect you're looking for. So, for example, like I'd probably, if I was going to use Omnes Narrow and syncing up with the regular, I probably would do some negative tracking on it. I'd probably track it in by like 10 units, 15 units or something like that. I think that will get you a closer feeling compared to what you got in spacing proportion relationships from the Omnes or regular. And I also probably use a lighter weight. So for example, if you're using the regular, I'd probably go down to the book in the narrow, right, to try to harmonize the weights compared to the regular. So those are some observations, just practical usages, because using narrow typefaces are useful because they allow you to put more words on the same line measure. Like notice here, notice the word time was able to be added by the narrow. So there's a purpose and a use for this narrow weight, but just be aware. I think that some of the design decisions contradict or challenge what the original Omnes project was trying to do from its visual relationships. So this has been Fontribute. This is Thomas Jockin from TypeThursday. I hope you enjoyed this episode, learned something new. I saw some requests for fonts to review, which I will get to. I saw those comments, and I will definitely take those up. If you have any suggestions of fonts you want me to explore and learn and talk more about, I'm happy to do so. Leave a comment in the YouTube, and have a great week, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.